This conference is brought to you by CodeStack, React and React Native development experts.
Hi there, thank you for joining me. Today we're going to talk about modern animating in React Native. This is going to be an introduction to React Native Reanimated version 2. So my name is Grant Sander. I'm a software engineer at Formidable. Formidable is a JavaScript consultancy. We use JavaScript tools to solve business problems for our clients. And so, as you can imagine, we're pretty big fans of React Native. It's great for building cross-platform mobile apps. So I want to start this talk with two pretty general and somewhat obvious claims. First of all, performance is important. So I'm not going to say much more about that. And also animation is important. I'm not talking like super flashy, crazy animations. I'm talking about like enough motion to show users when maybe app state has changed or that like our app is responding to their gestures in a way that they would expect. So when it comes to mobile apps, performance being important is especially true for lower end devices. We often need to support Android devices and usually like budget friendly Android devices, which don't always have the strongest processors on board. Also, animation is very important for mobile apps, given that they're very gesture driven. Users interact with their apps, their mobile apps, with their fingers. They're doing finger gestures. And so it's important for us to give enough animation to give them feedback that we're responding to their gestures in a way that they would expect. So let's get a little more specific. Let's talk React Native. So first of all, React Native is a great abstraction. I'm a pretty big fan. I'm guessing most of you are as well. One of the things that makes React Native so great is this magical bridge, which allows us to basically write JavaScript code. It gets executed on a JavaScript thread, and then it crosses over this magical bridge and gets executed on the native UI thread. So the fact that this code is being executed natively makes it fast and performant, makes it feel like a native app. But we get to use our favorite JS tooling like React. So that's pretty great. But one thing to point out is these bridge thing, it's very magical and it's very useful. But trips over this bridge are not free. So we have to be somewhat mindful of how many times we cross over this bridge. If you're trying to do this every 2 milliseconds, you might notice some UI lag. So let's get even more specific. Let's talk animation in React Native, since this is what this talk is basically all about. So first of all, animation is important. We already kind of decided that. It's true in React Native as well. And when we're building animations in React Native, we want to declare them in JavaScript with nice APIs. We don't want to be like writing native code to create animations. One of the beauties of using React Native is most of our app logic lives in JavaScript, and we use React's APIs and the broad JavaScript ecosystem. And we also want our animations to execute natively with minimal bridge strips. We want our animations to be buttery smooth, as I like to call it, but they need to be performant. We want our animations to be at least 60 frames per second. We don't want a bunch of UI lag with our animations. So this means we want these things to execute natively, and we don't want to make too many bridge trips because that might slow our animations down. So React Native actually provides an animated API for this. So this is sort of like the maybe standard way to create animations in React Native. But React Native's animated API actually leaves a little bit to be desired. It could be more performant. It could be more friendly to use. It could be easier to integrate with gesture handlers. And so you might be thinking, well, maybe there's a better way. So this kind of leads us into talking about React Native Reanimated. I'm just going to call this Reanimated as an abbreviated version. And Reanimated's been around for a while. It's on version 2 right now. They released version 2 just a few months ago. But version 2 is a huge, huge change from version 1. And it's very powerful. It's very friendly to use. And that's going to be pretty much the center of this talk. So first of all, why are we talking about a reanimated? Why aren't we just using React Native's animated API? Well, basically because it can offer better performance and easier to harness. So that's great for power users and for people who are maybe not power users when it comes to animation. So it offers a simplified JavaScript API and mental model for performant native animations. So it's similar to React Native's animated API in the sense that you're writing JavaScript code that gets executed natively, but it's got a different API and a slightly different mental model for these APIs. And it also offers additional control over animations via these things called worklets, which we're going to talk about, but this allows us to have even more control over our native animations. And it also offers powerful integration with gesture handlers. And this is like also very important because we need to use animation when we're, creating gesture handlers. They sort of go hand in hand. And all these things together basically means Reanimate offers us more power when it comes to animating in React Native. So let's do a quick conceptual overview of Reanimated. This is like just barely scratching the surface, but I just want to get enough on the table here so that we know what we're talking about. So Reanimated executes JS on a main thread via these things called worklets, and it minimizes bridge trips while writing JS. So you're basically writing JavaScript functions. They get executed on the main thread, and that's pretty awesome because you can write like native logic, logic that's executed natively while writing it in JavaScript. And then you connect to view props and styles via hooks-based API. So it's got a nice hooks-based API that allows you to basically connect to, views and other components. And then you can react to events on the main thread via hooks-based API. So you can kind of interact with native gestures. And we can actually pass messages over the bridge if we need to. So if we have some, logic executing on the native thread, and we need to call back into the JavaScript thread to maybe call a React method or something like that, we can do that. We can kind of pass messages back and forth if we need to, even though that involves, crossing over the bridge, which we try to minimize. But sometimes you can't avoid it, and it offers tools to easily do that. So on to Reanimated's APIs, just again, a very high-level overview. First of all, worklets kind of power this whole thing. And a worklet is basically just a JavaScript function that gets executed on the native UI thread. So I have a worklet written here. It's just a normal JavaScript function, clamp, which is a pretty common, animation function where you're clamping a value between a minimum and a maximum. So your value's not going out of those bounds. And the thing that makes this a worklet is like literally just this directive up here. You just write this worklet directive. And when you're using Reanimated 2, there's a Babel plugin that basically finds these directives and does some transformation on that and makes it a worklet. So writing like JavaScript functions that can be executed on the native side, it's as easy as just throwing this directive at the top. So pretty magical. So moving on, worklets are very powerful, but they're not really the main drivers of this, at least not at first. So one of the beautiful things of this is you can connect to props using this hooks-based API. So we have a use animated style hook that creates a style that's evaluated on the main thread and then updates a view on the native side. So basically you just use this hook, you return a style object, and it can be animated. You can do all the animation stuff inside of this style. And then we have an analog called use animated props. It's like use animated style, but for arbitrary view props. All right, so we also often want to animate values and create animated values. And so Reanimated offers a use shared value hook that creates a shared value. And a shared value is basically, it's sort of like a data structure that can be updated and read from like on the native side as well as the JavaScript side. And updating the value on the native side doesn't require a trip over the bridge. And so this offers some really nice performance benefits while still reasoning mostly on the JavaScript side of things. And then there's utility functions like with timing and with spring that allow you to animate a shared value. So this allows you to like apply some easing functions to a shared value and animate things. And that's a really nice API. There's an interpolate method because an animation library isn't going to be complete unless there's a way to map a shared value and do some linear interpolation. And there's also a use derived value, which allows you to basically create computed values that are derived from other shared values. So there's also some other methods that are similar to these, but this is some core methods here. Now, there's also some nice hooks for responding to gestures. So there's a use animated scroll handler hook, which creates a scroll handler for scrollables like scroll views, flat lists, section lists, things of that sort. So this basically just offers a way to create a scroll handler. And then there's a more general use animated gesture handler hook, which creates a generic gesture handler, which we would probably use with React Native gesture handler. So those two, React Native gesture handler and Reanimated, offer a really nice pair for creating gesture-driven animations. All right, so that's sort of like a high-level overview of Reanimated, but we haven't really looked at any code yet, and I actually want to get into some like real-world examples of like how you're going to integrate this in, and some techniques for doing some animating with Reanimated. So like day-to-day development, some scenarios might be you have a piece of state that changes and you want to notify the user with an animation. So you don't want things just to abruptly show up. Maybe you want to add some sort of animation. Another scenario, maybe you have an event occurs and you'd like to notify the user. So like maybe the user taps on something and you want to give the user some visual feedback that you're registering their touch. Another scenario would be you're customizing gestures and animations of core React Native components. This is actually really powerful. So you could tap into like a scroll view or a flat list and tweak animations. They already have great gestures and animations built in. Like you can scroll, that's sort of like a gesture and animation combo there. But you could actually tap into that and create your own logic like on top of it, which is really pretty amazing. And then sometimes you like just want to take full control over gestures and animations. You want to like just really write it all from scratch, handle all the gestures, and you want to add animations accordingly. So we are going to look at some examples. So let's dig into some code. First example I have here is basically just a 2-column list of images. And what I've done here is I've added this little activity indicator as the image loads in. These images are coming over the network, and so you can tell they take a little while to load in. So I'll show that one more time. So one of the things I like to do is just throw an activity indicator in while the image is loading. And then you see that the image just shows up. It just like pops into view. So one nice effect, or one nice place to maybe add an animation, is so that this image doesn't just like abruptly show up. It maybe fades in, it animates in. We can add a nice little transition there. So I have an image fade in component. The baseline of this is somewhat straightforward. We have an isLoaded piece of state, and then I have an image component, and when it loads, I basically set isLoaded to true. And then I have a little piece of UI here that says, if we're not loaded, show the activity indicator. So nothing too crazy here. But what I want to do is actually add some animation to the image loading in. So to do that, I might use the use animated style hook. So we might just call this animated style. We're going to use an animated style. Use animated style hook. You pass it a function that returns a style object. So one of the things we might do is like, to start, we might just set opacity to 0.5 and pass this through just to see kind of what it does. Probably not going to do much. One of the things we also need to do if we want to pass an animated style to a component is use an animated component. So right now I'm trying to pass an animated style to a regular image component, but I actually need to create an animated image. So I'm going to say animated image. Reanimated offers a create animated component, similar to how React Native's animated API offers a similar method that allows you to basically pass in a component and then create an animated version of that. So we're actually going to use an animated image here. And so now you can see that my animated style comes in and applies some styles here. Although it's like not very interesting because all I did was set the opacity to 0.5. But what we really want to do is animate this opacity in. So one thing we might do is set the opacity to a with timing. Now this with timing method will create a timing animation. And what we're going to do is if we're loaded, we're going to set the opacity to 1. Otherwise, we're going to set opacity to 0. And we're going to have a duration of, let's just say 400. So what this does under this, like under the hood, which is sort of magical, is if isLoaded is true, we have an opacity of 1, else it's 0. And when this isLoaded flag switches, Reanimated goes ahead and just animates that value for us. We don't have to create any animated values or shared values or anything like this. Reanimated kind of just handles that under the hood, which is a pretty nice thing. So let's see if that works. you can start to see these images start to animate in with opacity. And so another thing we might actually do with that is maybe we'll add like a scaling effect to this as well. So we could say, let's add a scale, and we'll do a similar thing of with timing. If we're loaded, let's have a scale of 1. Otherwise, like let's start at maybe 0.7, and we'll do a duration of, I don't know, let's say 300 milliseconds. We'll go ahead and refresh this. Now we should see as the images load, you can see that they actually fade in and they scale up, which is actually a really nice effect. So to add like a opacity and scale animation to these images, we just created an animated style. We use a couple of these easing functions, and Reanimated makes that pretty easy for us. We don't have to do a whole lot of boilerplate. All right, so that's a nice basic example of animating some styles, which is really powerful. So next, let's look at another example. So we're going to look at a custom pressable. So pressable is a relatively new API to React Native that sort of, you can use it to create your own touchables. And so what I did here was actually sort of just replicated the touchable opacity component using the pressable component API. So as I press in on this component, you can see that the opacity drops to 0.5, and as I let out, it changes up. But using the pressable API, you can see that when the pressable is pressed, we immediately apply an opacity of 0.5. So there's no animation here. It just immediately changes the opacity, which is fine. That's sort of like the standard behavior, but we might be thinking, well, maybe we want to animate that opacity to add a nice little effect. So let's go ahead and try that out. Let's start by creating a, let's call this press in progress, and we're going to create a shared value that starts at 0 and then animates to 1 as we press in. So on press in, what we're going to do is actually set the press in progress to a value of 1. And let's do a duration of 200. We're going to make this pretty quick. So whenever we press in on this pressable, we're going to basically animate the press in progress value up to 1. And then when we let go, or when the press is let up, we're going to animate back down to 0. So as you press in, this shared value animates up to 1, and then you let go, it animates back to 0. And then we can kind of use that to make some animated style. So let's go ahead and actually add an animated style to our pressable. One of the things we're going to need, again, is an animated pressable. If we want to apply an animated style, we need to use an animated component. So let's do reanimated.create animated component. We'll pass in pressable. So we're going to use an animated pressable, and we're going to create an animated style. So let's call this animated style again, and let's use the animated style hook. And we're going to return a function here. So the thing that we actually want to animate is the opacity, and we want to use the press in progress shared value to determine what our opacity is going to be. So we're actually going to interpolate on the press in progress value. As press in progress value varies from 0 to 1, what we want to do is vary the opacity from, let's see, a starting value of 1 down to an ending value of 0.5. And then we can add an extrapolation value. So we're going to do extrapolate.clamp so that we're not extending beyond this output range here. And so what we want to do is just apply. We're going to need to change this a little bit. Let's get rid of our old pressable style here. Let's just add in our animated style that we just created. All right, so now we have this thing animating. And let me slow this down a little bit. Let me make the animation, let's say 700 milliseconds just to make it really drastic, just so that everybody can see. So I press in, we animate the opacity down, and I let out, and the opacity animates back up. We could even probably make this a little more drastic, and let's animate the opacity down to 0.2. So that's like really slow. That's probably too slow to be usable, but just wanted to show everybody what that looks like. So maybe we stick to a duration of 200. So now we have a sort of touchable opacity like touchable, but we're actually animating the opacity instead of just setting it right away. All right, on to another example. Let's look at a on scroll example. Let's look at an example of tapping in to a scroll view. So this is where things get pretty cool. There's a lot of really amazing things you can do with this. I have this, sort of silly example content here where I have this neat horse image and I have a scroll view with just some filler content, nothing useful here. But I just wanted to add some buffer content there. And then I have this like sticky, in quotes, header that sticks at the top of this scroll view. But what I want to do is actually only show that if this big neat horse title has scrolled out of the view. So to do that, basically we need to figure out where this neat horse text lives. And then we need to track the scroll position. And once we've scrolled past it, that's when we show the header. So a couple of things we need to do is we need to create a couple shared values. So let's go ahead. We want to track the scroll position. So let's do scroll y is a use shared value. We'll start at 0. And then we also want to know like where our breakpoint is or like where that title is. I'm going to call it breakpoint. Let's do a shared value. I'm just going to set this to 1000, a pretty big value, but that's going to get updated. So first of all, what we're going to do is basically on this text component that has this neat horse, we can use the onLayout prop to figure out like how far down the bottom of that text is within the scroll view. So the breakpoint value is actually going to be the Y value of that text layout plus the height. So that allows us to figure out where basically the bottom of this neat horse title is. And the next thing we want to do is actually create a scroll handler for us to update this scroll Y value. So what we're going to do is create an onScroll method, and we're going to use animated scroll handler. So animated scroll handler gives us a function. We pass it a function with an event payload, and the event payload has basically like how far down we've scrolled. So the scroll Y value is going to be the events.contentOffset.y. So that gives us access to how far down the user has scrolled in this scroll view. And then what we're going to do is actually just attach that scroll handler to the scroll view. So what we're going to do is on scroll, we're going to pass it this on scroll function that we created. So we haven't really done anything yet. We've done some things, but we're not seeing anything show up. What we've done is tracked the scroll progress, and we figured out how far down this neat horse thing is. So what we're going to do is actually add an animated style to this header up here. So let's create an animated header style. We're going to use the animated style hook again. And we're going to return, what we're going to do is just basically change the opacity. And again, we're going to interpolate based on the scroll Y value. Now it's not magic, but there's some math that's going on here. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to look at the breakpoint value and we're going to back off a little bit. I have a fade offset constant that is something like 50. It's basically like, what's the threshold for making this thing show up? And so as the scroll view, let me format that a little bit. There we go. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at the scroll Y value. And then once the scroll Y value gets inside of this range, and so like once we get close enough to the breakpoint value, what we want to do is actually animate the opacity of this thing from 0 to 1. And we actually want to just clamp this value outside of that range. So let's go ahead and apply that to our header. We have this header thing here, animated header style. Let's attach that on there. So if we reload this thing, now we see that the header is not showing up, which is great. As we scroll down, we'll do it kind of slowly. You can start to see this header starts to fade into the view. So that's pretty neat. The opacity changes once this neat horse title gets close enough to the top, it starts to fade in. And once it's all the way off, we're at an opacity of 1. So that's a neat little effect for actually tapping into a scrollable component, which already has its own gestures and animations, but sort of tapping into it to extend it to do other cool things. All right, we're going to look at one last example. This one, we'll just kind of take a quick look at the code. We won't actually write any. So another thing that we mentioned we might do is actually like take full control over gestures and animations. So a pretty common example of this is like creating a pinch to zoom component. So I have my cute little horse here, and I might go zoom in on its nose by doing a pinch gesture. And then when I let go, we animate it back out to the original zoom. So to do something like this, which seems like it would be sort of complicated, and it's not trivial by any means, but Reanimated makes this pretty approachable. So one of the things we can do is actually wrap our image in a pinch gesture handler, which comes from the React Native gesture handler library. And we can attach a gesture event to that, which we'll look at. And then inside of there, we just create an animated view with an animated style attached to it. So basically what we're going to do is like create an animated style that scales up and maybe shifts around a little bit. And then we've just got our image sitting inside of there. So a couple things that we should look at is the pinch style itself. The actual like animated style for zooming the image up really just has a translate X, a translate Y. And the reason those are there is so that we can maintain the focal point. One of the things you'll notice is like if I pinch in on the horse's eye stays as the focal point of this gesture. So to do that, we actually have to do some math, and we do some translate X and translate Y. And then we're also scaling up by the scale value that we get from pinching. So creating this gesture handler is pretty nice. Reanimated offers a use animated gesture handler hook that gives us information about the, gives us some type information about the gesture we're looking at. And then it allows us to create this context object that allows us to basically persist data between gesture events. And so a common use for this is I have a CX and a CY. And a common use for this is when we start our gesture, this onStart method is called. And we get access to event information, and we get access to the context. And so it's common to do things like tack some information to the context object based on event information. So in this case, we look at the event's focal X. There's actually some math going on here, but we can attach some information to this context object, and then we can use that context object anywhere else within the lifecycle of this gesture, which is really nice. If you've done any animating with React Native's Animated API, sharing like these, like sharing values between life cycles of a gesture becomes really hairy, and you have to create extra values, things like this. So this method of creating a context object is really a nice improvement that comes with Reanimated. So then we have an onActive method that is being called as your pinch gesture is active. We have a little math here. So this is, you could do some matrix multiplication and some transformation logic and stuff like that. And then what we do is basically just update our shared values. So we've got some logic going on there. So as we're pinching, the translate X, translate Y, and scale values are being continuously updated. And then we have an onEnd method, which when the pinch gesture is done, all we're really doing is animating the translate values and the scale values back to their initial values. So we set our translate X and Y back to 0 and our scale value back to 1. So then all we have to do is attach that gesture handler to our pinch gesture handler, and that makes some magic. So that's sort of like the story of creating these custom gestures. If you're using React Native Gesture Handler, you can create nice gesture handler functions and attach it right to your gesture handlers. And it offers a really, really improved experience over React Native's Animated API. All right, so that's actually all I have for you today. Just some examples of using Reanimated API in some like real-ish world situations. So I appreciate you checking out this talk. If you want to find me on the internet, you can find me on GitHub or LinkedIn or even email if you're into that.